Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Testing, testing. For all the other future moderators today, we need to use this mic because we are live streaming this, and so Jesse wants to make sure that it picks up correctly. That was my opening statement. So I know all of you are probably coming from Pub Lab, but hopefully there's other students here too. And come on in. This is the journalism department's second day of, and today is the day of ethics. And ethics, as most of you know, is a core part of diversity, and it's a core part of journalism. And so we want to make sure that our students realize how important ethics is to what they're learning here and what they're going to take away in the future when you are all out reporting or in whatever field that you decide to go into. And so we put together an amazing day today for you all day, and you do get event credit for it. So please wait at the end. You can walk out the back and sign in one of the sheets. There's 5 sheets, so you can queue up in 5 different areas. I'm really excited to be the first moderator today because Martin Reynolds is our first speaker, and the conversation that he is going to lead you on is the relationship between diversity and ethics. And I'm very excited because Martin and I actually went to school here together. We were journalism students here 20 plus years ago, something like that. We were in the same classes, and he went on to an amazing career in journalism and is still working as an amazing journalist in Oakland. So he is currently the director of Reveal Investigative Fellowships. He is also a senior fellow for strategic planning at the Robert C. Maynard Institute for Journalism Education. And for those of you who don't know, the Maynard Institute was named after Bob Maynard, who was the first Black owner of a major newspaper in San Francisco, in the country, not just San Francisco, but in the country, and mainstream newspaper. There had been lots of African Americans who owned other mostly Black serving African American population serving newspapers, but this was the Oakland Tribune. He is the co-founder of Oakland Voices, a community storytelling project that trains residents to serve as community correspondents. Prior to his fellowship, he was a senior editor for community engagement and training for the Bay Area News Group and served as editor-in-chief of the Oakland Tribune between 2008 and 2011. He was also the lead editor on the Chauncey Bailey Project, formed in 2007 to investigate the slaying of a former Oakland Post editor and Tribune reporter, and a lot of SF State students were involved in that project. In 2008, we honored him as our Alumni of the Year. He is also a professional lyricist, loves to cook, is a connoisseur of fine spirits, and is an avid fan of boxing and the 49ers. He lives in West Oakland with his wife, who is a registered nurse. He has 2 teenage kids, 2 rats, 2 pythons, and 2 cats. So thank you, Martin, for being here.
No stories, right?
No, I promise. No personal stories.
Glad to hear that. Okay. Good morning. How y'all doing? One thing I love about San Francisco State is you are guaranteed to put in 5,000 steps no matter where you are on this campus. And for those of us who don't have great knees anymore, I was like, forgot my parking pass, had to go here, go back up 5 flights of stairs. I was like, damn. So it reminds me of my days here back in the 90s. So glad to be here. Good morning. We got a lot to get to today, so I'm going to talk at you for a little bit, but then I'm going to present some ethical dilemmas for you, and then you'll have an opportunity to sort of say what it is you would do in the situation. So we'll talk a little bit about diversity, how diversity, you could argue, is absolutely an ethical issue, right? We'll talk a little bit about sort of what those basics of ethics are, but then how diversity plays into that. But I'm really excited to get a sense of how you think. And so you'll be given some real scenarios that I was presented with when I was editor of the paper and how you would approach them. And so this will get lively. So let's get to it. All right. So You guys probably know some of this from your outstanding professors here at San Francisco State University. That is, being a storyteller. These are sort of the basic key tenets that I pulled out, sort of, that are vital if you're going to be a journalist. And I'm not going to belabor these a whole lot because I know that you will, there's going to be probably other speakers that touch on some of this, and this will also be work you'll experience studying journalism. How many of you are actually journalism majors, though? Okay, great, fantastic. Because, sometimes people are, strategic communications or public relations, and not that we want to talk bad about those people. They're very important, but they're not journalists. Okay, moving on. So these are all vital. And if you, when in doubt, always do this. And of course, this comes from the Society of Professional Journalism Code of Ethics. But the Code of Ethics I also want to talk about today are the code of ethics that go beyond simply the tenets of journalism, but speak to sort of the soul of what your obligation is as a storyteller. And when we talk about the fault lines, we're talking about the fault lines. These are the fault lines we're speaking of. And this is a framework which was derived by the Maynard Institute, by Maynard in particular, that really articulates that we all see the world through how we align across one of these. Right, so your race, your gender, your age, the generation that you were born in, and certainly your class has a huge determination for how this. So which is why when there's the conversation, for instance, around, say, police shootings, for example, and how certain people see that issue very differently depending on how they align across the fault lines. Right, so that's why when two people can see the same thing and we perceive it very differently. And that has large part because of how we align on the fault lines. And this is also a mechanism through which you can tell your story. So if you're looking at a story and you're saying, okay, well, oftentimes we look at, well, what's this issue? What's that issue? But think about if you look at a story from the perspective of, well, if we tell the story, how it looks across the issue of race or how it looks across the issue of gender or of class, then you get a much more nuanced, interesting story than just this side says this, that side says that. All right, the other part that's really critical here is when we talk about ethics, and the way I'm going to characterize this notion of telling stories across the fault lines and looking at how particularly we're going to focus primarily on race today, but I think race intersects with so many things that I think we don't want to solely focus on it. But this notion that if you don't look at your storytelling across the fault lines, then in many ways, I would argue, then you are not living up to the ethic, to the true highest level of ethics in journalism, which is to do no harm. Right? Because in many ways, if you are not accurately portraying a community and not telling the story of that community in the right way, you could think, well, maybe I'm not doing direct harm, but in fact you are. And the reason is why is because we in the media, the images and the stories that we tell, they impact how people perceive the world, right? And this isn't my opinion. We've gotten into the election season that opinion equates to facts, which really irritates the entire hell out of me. But I want to point out to you a study that's from 2006. There was a collection of research put together by Dr. Robert Entman, and that's where it comes from. And there's a particular passage that I think is particularly powerful. And this is a bit of a PowerPoint faux pas, but I'm going to do it. I'll read it to you so you guys can just relax. So before actually let me preface this was a study that was put together by a number of researchers to illustrate the impact that media images have on perception. And so this is a passage from that study, which talked about how the examples that one researcher cites is that showing that subjects are more likely to perceive minority persons as possessing weapons, even when they do not, and as a result are more likely to shoot themselves in experiments, that equally qualified applicants receive 50% more callbacks when their resumes listed the name Emily, prototypically white, than Lakeisha, prototypically black, and that interview situations between whites and persons of color can be poisoned by nonverbal and other unconscious communication microbehaviors. And as Kang writes, the total impact of these interactional phenomena on education, admissions, mentoring, employment, hiring, social networking, friendship, marriage, collegiality, and market transactions, and auto purchases, mortgage, and the like cannot be overestimated, which means that the images that media uses, the stories we tell, how we tell them, shapes the perception of people, and it shapes the perception of all of us. It's not like, well, white folks do this. No, it is even shown that a black patient going in to see a black doctor will receive substandard care from that black doctor unconsciously, right? Because of unconscious bias, which impacts us all. And so you understanding your unconscious bias, right, is critical as you take this journey as a storyteller, because we all have it. Right, when I'm in West Oakland, I see some, little teenagers walking down the street with hoodies, and they look. I'm like, uh-oh, what's about to happen? And I'm, African American man, pro-black, the whole situation, right? But we all, so it has infected us all. So that's a separate issue. What's important is that you recognize that. And I would say when you talk about what the tenets of ethics are, I think having an understanding of your own unconscious bias is absolutely a responsibility. Okay. I would say yes. I'm going to answer it for you. Because what has happened since 2008 in particular, when the big crash, particularly for newspapers, occurred, was there's a massive exodus, particularly of journalists of color, leaving media. So many of the gains that have been made over the last 40 years to diversify newsrooms, to bring more gender diversity actually was able to be relatively well maintained during that period of time. But it did disproportionately impact female journalists of color. But on the whole, the industry lost a tremendous amount of journalists of color disproportionately. And so as a result, and this at a time, as you all well know, the country is becoming more diverse, and yet now news organizations are less equipped than ever to be able to accurately and fairly portray the society that we all live in, right? I mean, this is sort of an anomaly where you see sort of this mixture of people in a room that are journalists. For the most part, it's very homogenous. San Francisco State does a good job of bringing in a diverse student body and has for a long time. So this is sort of not what when I go to many of these places, whether it's universities or other journalism organizations, it's not, the room doesn't look like this. So should it be seen as an ethical dilemma? I would absolutely say yes, because it doesn't mean that you have to be a woman to cover issues, or you don't have to be a person of color to cover issues within the diverse communities. I'm not saying that. I mean, I think a good journalist can tell good stories, especially if you know what you don't know. But to think that it doesn't impact the totality of coverage and the ability to understand nuance of communities, which is what we should be doing, which is what we should be explaining, very important. All right. Oh, our friends, our good friends. So this is going to step away from sort of the racial piece a bit, even though race is synonymous with this election season, but to another question that news organizations are facing right now is basically calling out bullshit and fact checking. Like, I read an interview with Dean Baquet of the New York Times, who's incredibly well-respected journalist. You know, the New York Times is obviously one of the best news organizations in the world. Mr. Baquet is a fantastic editor and a fantastic journalist. So it was interesting when I read this story about them saying that they were going to, their reporters were going to be being more assertive in pointing out inaccuracies when they're put forth by candidates, particularly in this instance, Donald Trump. And he said that it had been hard for them to do that. And I just was like, it really took me back, because I think to the days when I was sort of learning journalism, which was, this side said this and this side's that, and you endeavor to be objective when you walk in the room. And I just think that whole framework of of objective journalism and objective, we're just sort of these blank slates walking into a story and a situation is not, it doesn't work. It's not accurate. It's not real. And so in our, the unease in which journalists have with saying in a passage in a story, Mr. Trump says this, but actually that's wrong. And and then you cite what's correct. I don't know how that became hard, but for some reason it has. Now that's changing. It all of a sudden is changing. You see this assertive approach to coverage in the Washington Post and in other platforms, and even CNN has grown a couple of, I'm not going to say it, but they've grown some underlings and begun to finally actually say, well, actually that's not correct. But yet what they have been doing, which is very upsetting, is having these paid surrogates on both sides of the aisle. And I'm not going to excuse Mrs. Clinton supporters here either, where it's basically pundit, surrogate, and then somebody in the middle. It's like a parent. Okay, what's Billy say? What's Jane say? And they go back and forth. That's not journalism. Okay? So it's very upsetting. So this whole approach to the coverage of this election has been shameful, in my view. I think news organizations are beginning to get that now, but look what it has resulted in. And so I think in terms from ethics standpoint, you going forward, your obligation as a journalist is to call out inaccuracies and to be courageous enough to say, and to do the extra work to be able to then say, based on the preponderance of my reporting, what so-and-so says is actually inaccurate. And since so much of this is digital, then have a bunch of links to cite to where support that position, right? Don't make the reader have to go look it up and figure it out. That's your job. As you can see, it really gets me hot. I said, like tonight, I'm going to need Xanax and bourbon. It's going to be a whole situation. But I will say this, according to PolitiFact, she lies less than most politicians, and he pretty much lies every time he opens his mouth, which is not entirely accurate. It's closer to 8% or so. So let's just be, she's below 20, low 20s. He's like high 70s. The fact that that's like, oh, that's great, lies less than others. Like, how would that work? Like if I went home and said that, honey, I'm lying less than most people. Anyway, it's not even good. All right. Now, enough of my yammering at you with lecturing. Now we get to the part where you get to tell me what you think and what you would do. So we can sort of see who the little risk takers are here and who your professors should be looking at and watching out for. Yeah. All right, so what I'm going to do is lay out some scenarios. You're the editor, we'll say, of the Oakland Tribune, which doesn't actually exist anymore as a daily newspaper, which is another damn travesty that I won't get into now. So you're going to be the editor, and I'm going to lay out the scenarios. Then you are going to tell me what you would do, and then I'm going to tell you what happened in real life. All right? So I don't want all these little silent and don't say nothing. I heard journalism students get all quiet now. Like, what's going on with y'all? So I'm not having any of that. Participation is key. Okay, so let me run this back. First one, when the truth hurts. So the Oakland Tribune, your paper, you were able to secure a grant to bring on a violence reporting fellow, which is the whole new thing now, endowed reporting beats, who has covered wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And when examining homicide statistics in Oakland versus the number of soldiers slain in Afghanistan during that conflict, your fellow realized that soldiers on a well-guarded base in Afghanistan are safer than young African-American men living in certain neighborhoods in Oakland. So we decided to do a story, but there were concerns by some editors that once again, we're depicting Oakland in a bad light. And a little backstory for those of you who know Oakland, and there's a perception, Oakland is scary and bad. And so that's sort of the underpinning of you as the editor of the paper, is knowing that your community is constantly cast, right, in a bad light, right? And so you have this ethical dilemma of, okay, do no harm, right? You're like, am I gonna contribute to this ongoing narrative, right? Okay, so that's sort of the underpinning for you. Once again, there's concern, is my community being cast as a war zone? So your graphic artist comes up with a very powerful illustration, really laying this out. You're the editor with the last word. So the question is, do you run the story? Why not? And where do you run it? Is it a front page story, or does it lead your website? So here's the illustration. As you can see, sort of nondescript African American brother here, and then in soldier garb you got one of those bullseyes. And so the story here, and it talks about how essentially you would have more chance of being safe on a base in Afghanistan in a green zone than you would walking down the street, certain part of East Oakland. And that's actually real. That's not just made up at that time. You've gotten a little better. Okay, so do you run the story and do you run the illustration? I assume the silence has to do with your thinking deeply. Ma'am in the right.
I would run the story. I mean, even though you may be concerned with it depicting a certain narrative, I mean, I would think it's important to bring forth the truth with statistics, because especially something, especially something that's strong, because maybe that will lead to change.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? I know this is a room full of journalists, but people tend to not want to not run things, but yes, ma'am?
Well, just to be clear, it's comparing Oakland, like modern Oakland now, to how unsafe it is in Afghanistan.
Yes, it was during.
How unsafe it is in Afghanistan.
Correct.
Just to be clear. Okay. Definitely what she said about like bringing forth statistics, because Oakland has become a very progressive city, and it's like really getting impacted, but with gentrification. So I would have to argue against that publishing that would kind of be.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. We have 1 for, 1 against. Anyone else? We're not going. I'll probably take like 3 per or 4 just for the interest of time. Yes, ma'am.
Is the decision to not post publish stories depicting Oakland in a negative light, is that like a decision that the editorial team made, or is that like
Well, it hasn't been made. It's a decision that you as the editor, you're the top editor at the paper. So ultimately, you have the final call. You will make the call, whether or not to run the story, to modify it, to maybe, well, should it go here? Should it go there? Should you bury it?
Okay.
That sort of thing. So you kind of have the opportunity to decide what you would do.
Okay. I just had that question.
Okay, fair enough. So yes, editors generally have the final say.
I'm confused. Is this comparing like black youth to people in Afghanistan or all youth in Oakland?
I'm sorry, say again.
Are you comparing all youth or a race?
All youth. I'm
Specific
saying
race?
that you, as a whole, youth living in certain neighborhoods, particularly in certain pockets of East Oakland, are less safe than soldiers on a well-guarded base in Afghanistan.
Then I think it's
So not
important.
all youth, absolutely not all youth. No, some. Okay,
Oh, I'm not an editor, but I think it's important to run the story
okay,
and front page.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, comparing a base somewhere where there's war to a city where people are supposed to be safe,
Right.
it's powerful.
Okay, fair enough. All right, 1 more, and then we're gonna move on, and I'll tell you what happened.
For me, I would run the story,
Okay,
but I like how you said that Oakland is very progressive and there's a lot of gentrification going on. But I'm a broadcasting major and we're all about visuals, and I think a visual is worth 1,000 words. We could always do better, and I think that's just around everything in journalism, media, and everything. So by showing this, it shows yes, we're progressive, but we still have things we need to work on. So maybe they should start. That could lead to things going in a different direction, but you have to tell the story first, because if it's not getting put out there, then, oh, as progressive as we are, we're getting new buildings here, but what's happening to the youth?
Right. Understood. Okay. All right. Fantastic. So let me tell you what occurred. So we did run the story. Got a call the next that morning that it ran from the president of the Chamber of Commerce, who called my publisher and took great exception to us telling a story that was likening certain parts of Oakland to a war zone. What he didn't understand, and what my publisher kind of agreed with him, called my vice president at the time, and my VP was like, "No, what are you talking about? Number one, you live in Livermore. Number two, for some people in the community, this is a reality, and it's our obligation as the paper with the masthead of the city to point it out." And so I would just say to you, while I understand where you're coming from, because you do have to balance certain interests, right? You don't want to just put something out there that is just gratuitous. But as the paper of record for your community, you have an obligation, an ethical obligation, I would argue, to be the one. So like this notion, the metaphor could be like, I can talk about my family, but you can't. So that sort of notion, like, oh, like if you are truly the paper or the outlet of record for your community, and you are invested in that community, and you care about that community, and you've showed it in other ways, then I think you are absolutely the right folks outlet to tell that story versus someone else who's looking at it from the outside and doesn't have the same investment. So I would say what's critical in this equation is your relationship to the community, right? Have you done the work to be viewed as not tearing down the community, but lifting up its challenges? Mm-hmm. Microphone, check, 1, 2.
So what if the New York Times did the same research and was going to write a story like that?
Mhm.
Play that out for us. Do you think
Sure.
that they shouldn't do the story because they're outsiders?
No, I'm not saying that I don't think that they shouldn't do the story. I think they probably would do a very good job. I think their reporter would come in, they would be there for probably maybe even a couple of weeks. I think they would do a very good takeout, but it wouldn't feel as though it was being written from within the community, right? They wouldn't necessarily have the historical knowledge. They wouldn't necessarily have the relationship. So I'm not saying they shouldn't do it. I'm not saying the Chronicle, right, shouldn't, parachute in and do a crappy job that it does of covering the city. But I just think that so yes, of course you can do it. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't, but so often when I've seen like the New York Times come and do stories about like Brooklynizing the city of Oakland, and the Chamber of Commerce people are all giddy about, oh, we've been Brooklynized. And I think from the way the community feels about that outsider view, and you can tell when you read it, right? You can feel the way it's written. It's not written for us, by us, like FUBU. It's written outside in. And that's not a bad thing. It's just different. And I think I think it feels different for the community. But I think there's value to others who want to know about the community outside. So it has value. It can be done. But I think I think it feels different. Yes, sir.
So content-wise, does it go into the reasons why Oakland is such a dangerous place? If the story goes in, it does go into
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely.
So then technically you're not necessarily directly contributing to that overplayed narrative if you're giving context to why it is that dangerous systematically, policies in place.
Yeah, it definitely goes into that. It has anecdotal. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
It does.
Okay.
All right, let's move on because we got a lot to get to. Very good questions. Good stuff. Okay, now this next one caused some issues in the meetings. All right, so in an 8-hour stretch in late February, I guess this was in 2011, 4 Oakland residents were shot. Most of those doing the shooting are involved so deeply in street life that experts say they have slipped into a kind of an alternate reality in which the rules of the the rest of society lives by do not apply. And this is some text from a story that your reporter was working on and that you got a chance to look at. Their rules, in turn, wouldn't make sense to those who don't share their experiences. For many of these kids, the amorphous set of street rules that governs their behavior has a name, the Mac God. Take Danny, an Oakland teen who's been living by the code of the street since he was 13. When his mother kicked him out of their East Oakland home, he started robbing people at gunpoint that year. He broke into homes and began dealing. After a few stints in juvenile hall, he joined a violent East Oakland street gang. It all led to the moment last fall when he found himself on the ground, bleeding from a gunshot wound and staring down the barrel of an enemy's pistol. Click. When they see me, they shoot at me. And when I see them, I shoot at them, he said. We got to retaliate. If we don't, they'll shoot us, kill us. It's better them than us. That's how everybody should see life. Danny and hundreds of other youths just like him believe an ordering force governs the violence surrounding them. Surreal as it sounds, the Mac God is as real a power as anything else in Danny's young and relatively brutal life. The Mac God is in the streets, he says, and the people doing bad things that live this life go by the Mac God, he said. I love God, but I believe in the Mac God, and if you cross him, I believe he will get you. So here's the issue. Your graphics, so you're like, oh, damn, that seems like a rather intense situation. So your graphics department puts together a dynamic illustration that depicts this fictional version of the Mac God. Many in your team think, well, you're all sitting around the editorial table trying to decide what's going to go in the paper, go on the site. And you all thought that many folks thought it was very powerful and illustrated the story. So it was budgeted as a lead package. But as you got ready to publish, your executive editor said that she was concerned about the use of the illustration. She was concerned about the potential that it might offend readers. So now you make the case for why this story about the Mac God should run and make the case why it should not. So here is the illustration. If you'll notice, these are pistols that go around sort of these heavenly lights. So that's the illustration. So should the story run? Should the illustration run?
I'm for the story against the illustration.
Okay.
I think if the story is truthful, then fine, run it. It's telling the story. But the illustration, if it's not gathered from that community and what they believe that their Mac God looks like and is surrounded by, I don't think as a storyteller you get to choose what that God looks like.
Okay. All right. Anyone else? Thoughts, opinions, reactions? React to me. Okay.
I mean, I can just see a lot of with that illustration. I mean, I kind of understand the story. I'm like on the fence.
On the fence on
The story.
on the fence. on the story.
I like the story because it's giving a perspective that you don't usually hear. Usually you're hearing this is what's going on, but you're not hearing from the actual youth or the people who are going through these scenarios.
Right.
Especially on that side.
Right.
I could see just a lot of religious backlash from that image,
Okay.
honestly.
So it taps into trying to think what ethical, if there's an ethical passage in it. It's accountability, there's do no harm. Well, fair, accurate. I mean, all right, anyway, I'm just thinking in my head which one it might intersect with. But okay, this gentleman over here.
I think in that editorial meeting, I would ask the question of the board for discussion, is this illustration better than a photo of the source who has given us that description of the Mac God?
Okay.
So.
One quick note, you do have some photos of people, but you're not trying to show faces just because gang affiliations and the like. So you have a photo. So there are photos of the young people, but their hats are kind of down like this. So you do have some traditional art with it, but nothing that's going to identify the person. So that would be like secondary art. Okay. All right, one more and then we'll go on.
I guess I would feel like concerned about the story. I think it would probably be fine to run, but like the way it's written.
Can you talk about it?
Yeah, the way it's written so far, it seems like it has a lot of potential to be like sensational. And that art, like running with that story would make it just seems like it makes it look like it's kind of like a cult of violence rather than like a culture that accepts violence, I guess.
Okay.
It seems like that like throws it over the top a little bit.
Okay. All right. Excellent comments. Very thoughtful, reflective. I like that. Journalists who are thinking about what they do before they do it. So let me tell you what occurred. What did occur? Oh, yes. Okay. I remember now. So I got into a really big argument with the executive editor for this story because, again, I felt that this person, number one, you live in Alameda. And not that it goes to that, back to the notion of the fault lines, right? How geography impacts perception, right? So this is a person that didn't know anything about these streets, right? Your role as a journalist is to highlight. So often when the violence was occurring in your city, people are like, well, what is going on? Why is this happening? What are these people thinking? How could they possibly act this way? It seems so foreign. It seems so just egregious and just so completely out of the norm for how probably all of us in this community would behave. This was a story that attempted to articulate that no matter how bizarre, over the top it might seem to be, it actually is, right? Like that if folks are actually kind of thinking like this, that it explains a lot. And so the thinking was, and then the illustration was sort of, I mean, it's intended to be art. It's intended to be something that is open to interpretation, right? So oftentimes, I mean, that was obviously my editorial style of trying to sort of push things a little bit more and be a little bit more creative. But I also think that it was something, the intention was to hit you, to make you think, to feel something, not in a gratuitous way, but in a way that helps to capture the essence of this outlook on life. So ultimately, we had this big argument in the editorial meeting. So I initially wanted to make it a front page story, lead illustration, and I wasn't able to. So what I was able to do was we made it. He agreed to run the story, run the illustration, but in the blue plate position, which would be this position, bottom of the fold. Front page, but bottom of the fold. The story was here and the photo was here. So also the executive editor was Catholic. So there was some issue there. But overall, a lot of people in that meeting were really supportive of this. And I also want to point out that the illustration was done in a photo department that was actually diverse. There was African-American artist who was working on it. So it wasn't like you just had people who are not sort of connected to this issue creating illustrations for the story. All right. So, but it was tense. It was people's values came up and ultimately the story was able to run and people really responded to it in a very positive way. They were disturbed, they were upset, but it helped to illustrate something that they otherwise would not have understood. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, Martin, one question I have is when you mentioned some of the other images, the photos you had,
yeah.
like my concern there, I'd be curious if there was any discussion. in some respects, is that a stereotypical, here's the photo we expect, and so people kind of look over. And I'm just curious if there was any discussion of this in relation to, here's what we would do instead.
I wish I could say yes, that's what we thought, but it wasn't. It was sort of more thinking of, that wasn't really, the thinking was that I think this would be more interesting. It would be, rather than just the photo, it wasn't sort of like the stereotypical photo, it was more that, why are we always just going to use a photo that shows somebody's, let's do something different. Yeah. Okay, the next scenario. All right. So you have a team of 2 female reporters. They have found a young woman. Her name is Desiree, and she is a former sex worker who was trying to rebuild her life after getting on the streets through the help of this project called MISSY, which is called Motivating, Inspiring, Supporting, and Serving Sexually Exploited Youth. It was through this organization that your reporters found this young woman, this child, really. The 2 reporters, as I mentioned, are both women, one African-American woman, one white woman, one sort of in her 30s and one in her late 40s. So in general, when talking about rape survivors or those who have been sexually exploited, and certainly minors, news organizations, at least reputable ones, tend to not report their names. In newspapers, we certainly never report names. Same thing with juvenile arrestees. But in this instance, the reporters were told by Desiree that she wanted to come out from behind the veil of anonymity, to show her face and use her real name. They are pushing you to use, so they're going to do a story about her and her struggles and her reemergence after being a sex worker. They're pushing to use her face, use her name, and assuring you that she and her family understand what this could mean for their future. Her mother had also given permission. So here's just the question being, when do you protect a source from themselves? So here it is. You've got, let's say for the sake of argument, you're a male editor. You have 2 female reporters who found a source through an advocacy organization to do a story. And she's the source is a woman of color. One of the reporters on the story is a woman of color, closer to the woman's age, maybe a little more than twice her age. The young woman wants to step out of the veil of anonymity, talk about her struggles, and be empowered, right? To come out from behind the shadows and say, this happened to me, and now my life is together again, and I'm moving forward. So they put together a story. It's coming very close to deadline. Copy editors are saying, hey, we need to get the photos on the site or on the page. What do you do? Do you run her photos? Do you use her name? What do you do? 14.
She's 14. Thank you.
My first question for her and her mother would be, what do they expect out of her name being released?
Mhm.
Like, what are they going to get out of it? What is the real point of it? And my opinion on it is, I don't think that a newspaper that is, unbiased and reporting the truth, I don't think that's the platform for that.
Okay.
I think she needs to go on a talk show or do a documentary or do something if she wants to get her name out.
Why is it not a
there.
platform?
I mean, it just seems kind of advertising to me, not necessarily an actual ad, but you can tell the story, and because you choose not to run the minors and because it's kind of a sensitive topic and what she's been through, and the whole question is, when do you protect them from themselves? I think, like I said, first I'd have to understand what they expect to get out of it. Because if they don't really have an answer, or they don't really know,
Okay.
then I think that's a conversation that needs to be had.
Okay. Is that your job as a journalist, to ask what they expect to get out of it?
Well, I would just ask that, and just because I don't, why would they want their name? I would ask them why they would. Besides that, I
We
want
run
to come
stories
out.
about Apple and all kind of, restaurants, and we give Apple free advertising, and other phones coming out. I mean, Like, shouldn't they just buy an ad?
But what is the story? Like, is it featuring her overcoming all of this?
Right.
I mean, I don't see a problem with running her name, because if they're really adamant about it and that's the story that they're telling and that's what you are going to say.
Right.
But I would definitely ask the question, why? Why do you want your name out there?
Fair enough.
Because I would want an answer.
Understood. There and in the back. Where'd she go? Okay, yeah, go ahead. And then in the back.
I think it would be a good profile story to run, since, it talks like it's a 14-year-old girl who is like on a website like that was like basically for erotic purposes and everything. And if she gets consent from her mother, like since she is 14 and not at the age of 15, then yeah, it would be okay to run the story.
Okay, and what about her name and her photo?
Her name and her photo, definitely. I mean, so just to be clear, she wants to not be anonymous.
Correct.
At all? Okay, then, yeah, as long as the parent consents, like since she is underage, then I wouldn't see no problem running the story.
Okay, all right. In the back, there, and then to the left.
Who's back here?
And then up to the front.
Yeah, I just think it's a bad photo. I'd run a story though. If
So that wouldn't be the photo, that's just a.
Okay, well,
It'd be a photo of like,
all right, yeah, definitely get a good photo, run a story.
So you would use a photo?
Yeah, I would.
Of her face?
Yeah.
Okay.
If she's giving everything, like saying she's a minor and she's consenting to everything, you can't be held like for like defamation and all that. You can't like be held for anything, and that's rare for a story like this. For somebody to hold that back, like, hey, because when you publish like rape, you can't really come out with their names and what happened. But here she is saying all that. So yeah, I think, and then you get a community awareness like, hey, this girl made it. Right. This little girl made it. And if she made it, then maybe, we can come out of whatever it is that we're going through. So I definitely run it.
Okay.
Get a different image up there of her coming out through it, or like I said, profile pic.
Gotcha.
But yeah.
Okay, up here and then back there. Right here. Yes.
I would run it, but I would let the parent. I would make them understand the safety of what would happen if they do release the image, the face, and the name.
Right.
And if even after laying that out to them, and they do still agree and they still want to be releasing everything so she can have a face and be out of it, I would still run the story as is.
Okay, and we've got only time for one more. I'm gonna let this guy, because you've had great comments, but
I think in this scenario, I think it's really hard for sources to understand like the gravity of the situation and to understand really the impact that a story could have, especially if it's a really well-known publication. So I think the question to ask for this would be, would running the photo of her face and her full name add enough to the story to make the risk worth it? And I think in this case, it probably wouldn't.
Okay. All right. So what happened? So this was a situation where I was really felt like I wanted to sort of be where, as journalists, I think we're all idealistic, right? We want to think the best of people, and we want to think that if they really want to do something, that we should let them, right? We should give them the power to take control of their lives. And so I sort of was like, okay, well, yeah, all right. I was like, I drank the Kool-Aid and was like, okay. The reporters were like, we got to do this. They're both women. I'm like, okay, well, they're women. One's a woman of color. I'm like, well, who the hell am I to say, right? Sort of that whole sort of gender issue came to play for me, feeling like, well, why should I get in the way? These women, they feel that this is important, right? And that should be respected. So just when we were getting ready to sort of, the point of no return, we get a call from, well, first my executive editor, who was a different executive editor at the time, said, are you crazy? We're not running this girl's photo. We're not running her name. We can use her first name or a pseudonym, but we're not running this. You guys are nuts. She's 14. And if her mother has given permission, what's wrong with her mom? Right? Also, her mom, like, what happened when the child was out on the streets? So he was like, no, you fools are nuts. The reporters were pissed. And I felt like I had been neutered. And I was just like, what the hell does he know? No shit. And like, I shit you not. 5 minutes later, we get a call from her mom. She is freaked out, talking about, I didn't understand what was going to happen. Please don't run this. Please don't use her name. Please don't use her phone. To your point, did not understand the gravity of what was about to occur. What didn't have an issue with the story itself, but in terms of the identifying information. So what we did was we took out her name, used a fake name. We used a photo where she could not be identified, and the story was fine. Her story was told. People thought it was inspirational. She was, there was enough information in there where, we knew who she was. It was everything that it needed to be, it was, without her identity being revealed and it being something that would follow her for her entire life. So that falls under the rubric of do no harm, right? Don't let your idealism get in the way of protecting the very community that you are seeking to report on, right? And don't get so caught up in that you're about to change the world. Be careful, be cautious. Yeah.
For your all perspective, as the chair of the department, I act as the publisher of the Express, and I would say at least twice a semester, I get an email from somebody that one of you has used as a source in the past, and says, can you please take that story down? Mm-hmm. It's affecting the rest of my life. I can't get a job because of this story. And I have to say, no, we can't do that. If your lawyer wants to get in contact with our lawyer, that's the only way we can potentially resolve this, and only if it's libelous. And probably about 6 months ago, maybe last semester, there was a story that ran, a young woman surrounded by sex toys. Remember that story? And I thought, oh my God, in 5 years, I'm going to get that student is going to come and say, can you please remove that photo? Because I was 21 and I didn't realize the impact that it would have for the rest of my life. So I'm really glad that you brought this up, because it's brought so many things up for me and what I go through as the publisher. And I'm really glad that they called you on that.
Yeah, me too. And that's all, not only save a source from themselves, save an editor from themselves, save reporters from themselves, right? That's why news organizations at their best have layers, right, of accountability. So that, that would have been bad. It would have been real bad. And so I'm glad that didn't happen. We go to 11:15? Okay. All right. There was another point that I was going to make about that I can't remember now, but it'll come back to me. I guess the point being that, to your point, actually, Cristina, I've taken down 2 stories when people have contacted me about, can I take them down? And in neither case was it someone who committed, like if it was a felony or there was some sort of crime committed or something like that, then I'd be like, look, man, I can't, I'm sorry. I know I can't do it. But these were other instances where people had gotten into trouble, and then it wasn't anything incredibly egregious, but it was just sort of, if they got their name Googled, back in the day, he got caught doing this and and I've had some, that maybe I should have used that. I've actually taken 2 stories down like that, because I'm like, and I've gotten pushback from the people on, well, why are you taking it down? I'm like, cuz it's not like the president. It's not like, it's not a public figure, it's a private citizen. So I used to be hard in that regard that you would take. Now I'm a little different on that now. I'm kind of like, well, who is it? What's the circumstance? Why are they asking? And if there's no real reason that it has to be there for the record, then I'm sort of like, and it's going to affect, I'm going to take it down. But it's only been 2 instances, and I've been asked many times. But I'm open to explore that in a way that I wasn't before, because the internet is forever. Yeah, because the internet is forever. And I just think that it goes back to this ethical point, right? Like of do no harm. And I wonder what about that story of the sex toys? I mean, does it really need to be there? It's not like the person's a political figure or someone that held office or was a big leader in the community and was caught for malfeasance or embezzlement, like something like that. No, that's not coming down. That's staying. Sorry, even if you're reformed. But a private citizen, I'm a little softer on. Yes, ma'am.
But don't you think that's just kind of in, like, especially for a student publication like that, in terms of the sex toy picture, don't you think that's just kind of like feeding into the, oh, I made mistakes and that I can make them go away? You know, like, it's just like, you got to just live with the decisions you've made. I feel like that's just kind of like, you know, you can just do things and then just have them be erased, you know, because you make the right phone call or somebody makes the right phone call for you. Like, and in terms of protecting people from themselves, you guys have proven that it happens pretty often, that people didn't understand the repercussions of what they were going to say. Is it our job to do that every single time? Is it our job to be the world's like teacher? Like, why do I have to be the one to like tell these people these things?
Not every time, but not every time, but you are the one with the platform that would potentially reach tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of people. So you have an obligation, and you're in the profession. You understand what the potential impact could be. So yeah, you have an obligation to be responsible, to think, okay, and in certain situations, like if it's a politician, if it's a public figure, no. But if it's a private citizen, I think that more care should be taken. I truly believe that. Yeah, you don't look like you believe that, but I think you need to believe. We'll take questions. That could be the last scenario.
Is the work of the journalist to produce the story in consideration when you make that decision? Or is the journalist brought into the discussion of whether or not the story is taken down, that the reporter who wrote the story? Just because if it's a big story, there's probably days of
I think if
work.
it's a big story, I mean, that's why I say, I think if it depends. I mean, this is the story I'm talking about that was taken down was a story about somebody who was a teenager, a youth at the time, and they were in some youth program, and they were sort of like, the cliche story of, he got into trouble, and then he got into this program, and then he turned his life around. So in my view, it was pretty benign. Like I was like, well, it says you were a teenager, you got in trouble, then you turned your life around, and now you're chill. So in my view, I thought the person I was like, I don't know why that story needs to come down, but I don't know, it's their life. And I just think that we have to be mindful of that. I'm not saying that you do it every time. I'm not saying you just willy-nilly, I'm just going to take that down. Like they can just make the call, like take that down. I mean, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that you should think about it. You should not be so callous to think that, well, it's not my job to teach you about media literacy. I mean, that sort of speaks to this other notion about diversity in media and ethics, how many communities have been cast and portrayed by news organizations that don't reflect the diversity of the communities that they're in. So I think that there's a lot of reasons to be reflective in that situation.
I was going to say, there's a great quote by Janet Malcolm. He has a microphone. Let me bring it.
I like how you're saying there's no hard and fast rule. It's case by case. But when you're making the private citizen argument, the first thing I thought of when you said that was that politicians didn't start off as politicians. They were private citizens at one time. So I think you have to take that into consideration also.
Absolutely. That's why I say it's a case by case basis. You have to look at each instance on its merits.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say before I move to my Janet Malcolm quote is I think anybody who's worked in the industry long enough, you get that phone call and you feel bad. When I was at Wired, when I was at PBS Frontline World, you would get that call and you would think, gosh. And there was a great quote that made me, I think, kind of put what I would feel in perspective. And it's by Janice Malcolm, who wrote a book called The Journalist and the Murderer. And she has a great quote where she says, any journalist who isn't too full of him or herself or too naive knows what they do is kind of morally indefensible. And I think that kind of raises the question of you've always got to ask that question of what are my motivations and what am I doing and what's the fallout?
That's right. What's the impact? Impact it's important. All right. Do you guys want to ask questions or look at another scenario? All right. I think this is a good one because this also speaks to, your concerns. So when do you report what you have, right? So the family of John Jones has been through this terrible, terrible tragedy. Mr. Jones, he's the patriarch of the family, and he was caught in the crossfire of a gang shootout and killed right in front of his house and in front of children and stepchildren. Your reporter was able to connect with the family and get into their lives as they tried to recover from this horrible trauma. It took about 3 months for your reporter to gather their information, get to know the family. You spent countless hours with them during that time to craft a heartfelt series of excellent stories that actually paint this family as loving, strong, resilient in the face of a horrible loss. As the story is beginning to near publication, the family expressed second thoughts about being featured in the paper. Even though they had moved from the neighborhood where the shooting had taken place, more than 4 cities away, they still didn't want their story told. In addition to that, the suspect who had done the shooting had been apprehended and was in jail and was not about to get out. As the editor of the paper, you have now freed up your reporter for months to do this story, a luxury few publications can afford. Do you run the series of stories, and why not? So here's Mr. Jones and his wife. Mr. Jones had married this lovely woman, become the stepfather to her kids. He was just the kind of guy. He rented a home. He rented the house where he lived, and his yard was always pristine. He was like the epitome of the kind of neighbor you would want to have. Right? But now his family is like, well, we don't want you to run the story. The other point that is important to note here is that the representative from Catholic Charities, who helps families recovering from trauma, was involved in helping to connect you to this family, to your reporter to this family, and you've talked to them, and they're experts in people who are dealing with trauma. And you've consulted them saying, well, what do you think? Like, should we run the story or should we not? And one of the things that trauma causes is for people to perceive danger when danger actually doesn't exist. And this isn't your opinion, this is the opinion of the caseworker who's dealing with the family. So basically meaning, she says, I don't think it would matter if they were in New York City and this was, 10 years from now perhaps, or wherever maybe they could be on a completely different continent, they probably would still feel unsafe. So do you run the story?
Yeah, it sounds to me like this situation is kind of like the inverse of the last one, where instead of making sure that your source understands long-term negative impacts that a story might have on their life, this one, I mean, it might not necessarily have a positive effect, but I don't understand the negative one if like certain permanent decisions have taken place. So if I would want to know why they are suddenly having second thoughts on running the story. And like, I wouldn't feel comfortable coercing them into being comfortable with running it, but I would just make sure to like be really cool and explaining like, I'm not trying to talk you into anything, but these are all the facts and like, you really don't have anything to worry about.
But keep in mind that according to the caseworker, that logic isn't necessarily going to resonate because people who've been through trauma perceive fear even when no fear exists.
Right. But I mean, you're not a doctor either. And so like, you can only do what you can do. And being informed in the decision or informing your sources on the decision is all that you can really do.
Okay, fair enough.
Going off of that, I mean, I definitely understand the sense of fear that they might be feeling and not wanting to like relive such a tragedy that they went through. But I mean, I definitely think it would be a great story to run, but it's also important as an editor to respect their feelings and their emotions. And if this is something that's going to be hard harder for them to cope with and like make it harder to kind of go on with their lives, I wouldn't run it.
Okay.
But if I did report the story, like I'd kind of push to run it, but it's also there's like a middle ground, I guess.
Okay. Well, you keep in mind, you let a reporter go out for 3 months, not work on anything else. You had a photographer there, a ton of time to get photos. You wrote a series, not one story, a series of stories. 3. Okay, go ahead.
Well, after you
It's
just said
ready to
that, I mean, honestly, though, after you just said that, but I kind of agree with her. Like, I think it's their story to tell. And if they don't want their story out there, it's not my, like, I mean, it is my job to tell a story, but I don't think it's, you know, my duty to tell a story that someone doesn't want out. So
Really?
personally,
You don't think that's your job?
well, I mean, in this situation, I think when it comes to tragedy, that you have to look at it differently.
Okay.
Yeah. They're
But,
private
okay,
citizens.
I want to point one other thing out
Mhm.
that I forgot to mention in my notes, which I don't, was that the shooting was obviously very public.
Mhm.
Stories have been written about this family because of what occurred. So the breaking stories have been, the name of the family had been out there. So this wasn't like the first piece of journalism that had been written about this family. This was a larger takeout on the whole situation. But their name is already public. I mean, you have every journalistic right by every standard of journalism to be able to run it, because it's already public. I mean, everyone in the Bay Area has already done a story on it, but they don't have this story. They don't have this one. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna just jump to what happened. Okay. So what I did was I called one of the sons and got on the phone with him and had about an hour-long conversation about the story. I didn't let him read it, but I did tell him the gist of what was being written. I didn't tell him that I didn't like read him quotes back or anything like that, but I said, here's an example of an anecdote that the reporter wrote. Now, normally I wouldn't necessarily do that, but I felt in this situation, it was appropriate. He was like, well, we just don't want it out there. And this is, we're tired of this and we don't want to do this anymore. And I was like, man, it's a great story about you and your family, about John, about Mr. Jones, about how you all have come together and rallied around each other and are resilient. And I said, it embodies everything, the courage that many people I don't think would even have. He wasn't trying to hear any of that. I don't care about that. It doesn't matter to me. We can't do this. And I was like, okay, well, I understand where you're coming from. And I got off the phone with him. And I just had to sit and think about, okay, are we doing harm? Like, is this the right thing to do? Is this appropriate? I asked my boss. Always ask your boss. Always go up the chain of command, say this, and laid it out. Had him read the stories. He was like, these are great stories. I was like, well, what do you think? Called back the caseworker. Said, okay, so this is what we're thinking. What do you think? I said, do you ever think these people will be okay with the story? You can say, yeah, maybe like in 10 years. Can you hold it for 10 years? I was like, no. So ultimately, we decided to run it with their names, photos, front page, the whole deal. And story went over fantastic. People they loved them. They had got so much support, calls. The son called back and said he really liked the story. And so, and no adverse ramifications. Like, it wasn't like there was some, retaliation or anything. It was just like this huge outpouring of support and love for this family and respect for them and the courage that they had shown. And so it was an example, but I wasn't sure if it was the right decision. I mean, sometimes you don't know if it's the right decision until it happens. But I think the key point in all of these instances is thinking, reflecting, talking to your colleagues, talking to your bosses, looking over going back over the code of ethics, looking at your own code of ethics, certainly as it relates to coverage of diverse communities, right? How is this impacting communities in a different way? Not only looking at the SPJ's code, but looking at other codes, moral codes. The tenets of journalism are there, but oftentimes they are the lowest hanging fruit of what you can do. There's another level. So I think you guys have all displayed tremendous thoughtfulness and a willingness to give sources their power, but understanding that sometimes we have to protect them from themselves so that we can do the job we need to do as journalists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin.
Thank you.
So as you file out, there's 5 sign-up sheets in the back. So go ahead and sign in or sign out. Make sure to put the classes you're in. And we'll be setting up for the next panel. And Rochelle is the moderator. No, who's next? I have to look at my flyer. It's Kim? Kim, you're the next moderator. So if you could come up so I could give you some instructions real quick, please.